And I'm Stanley Leong with Justine Moss. Thank you for joining us here on CNA938. It is going to be an awfully quiet Olympic Games in Japan this year as the opening ceremony in Tokyo gets underway this Friday. Empty stands and bleachers with arenas and stadiums devoid of rapturous cheering by spectators because the athletes who will be competing will not have spectators in the stands.
That's right. And the absence of spectators will be most greatly felt by the athletes competing. What we want to know is what impact will the Spectator-less Games have on the athletes? Many athletes thrive, of course, off the energy of fans and that vibe, but could having no crowds in attendance help one stay better focused on Olympic glory?
What do you think, Justine?
It's a tough one, isn't it? I mean, if you don't have that cheering, then maybe you'll focus a bit more. But then some thrive on it. They want the crowd behind them. So it's a really hard one.
Yeah, but like you play golf. I'm sure you've taken part in some golf tournaments before. I mean, do you like crowds and people cheering you on the sides?
I just try and shut it out. Actually, I need to focus on that little white ball.
Okay. So to some it works. To some, I'd rather not have spectators around. Well, let's find out from our guest. He is familiar with all that goes on in the head of sporting professionals. After all, he has been team consultant and traveling psychologist to numerous national teams of Singapore. And of course, they've taken part in big games like the Olympics and the Paralympic Games as well. Edgar Tham joins us again. He is founder and chief sport and performance psychologist at Sport Psych Consulting. Edgar, good to have you with us today again. Thank you for joining us. Now, Edgar, it is going to be a spectator-less games. Do you think that athletes who will be competing in Japan have been psyching themselves up for a very different atmosphere from the ones that they've been used to, with spectators in the stands and cheering them on once the gun goes off?
In fact, if you ask me, most athletes are always prepared for competition where there is the spectators. But, Tokyo, the organizers basically, changed the rules. And this round, it is going to be the strangest, if I may use the word, Olympics ever. No crowds. But to me, it's also a good thing because if you think about it, athletes spend about 80% of the time practicing, training. And therefore, if you think about it, it makes logical sense that without the crowds, it's going to be something similar to like in a practice session or in a normal training day. So if athletes can kind of like switch their mindsets back to the current situation as if, it's training or it's practice time, then in this way, it won't be, to me, in my mind, a distraction.
But what about the ones that, Edgar, that have sort of been there, done that before and had perhaps 2 Olympic Games under their belts? They're used to those crowds. They're used to that cheering, the whole vibe, that electric atmosphere in the stadium. What about them to then have to go to a spectator-less stadium?
Yeah, will they be at a disadvantage?
I would think probably yes, because they're so used to that kind of energy that they draw from the crowds. I remember there was one Olympics, I think this was in Australia, was it not? Or one of the major games. I think it was a Commonwealth Games rather. And this athlete was, getting the crowds to clap. And then, he got them to clap louder and faster. And then that's where he got himself psyched out. And then when he did his performance, I think it was a field athlete, and he was able to do what he needed to do. And in fact, that was after when he tried several attempts, couldn't get through it. It was probably because he was nervous or he wasn't psyched up enough. And he used the crowd to help him and to support him psychologically. Wow. So yeah, there might be some athletes who might see this as a potential distraction. So they'll probably have to readjust their strategy and find ways to, kind of get their arousal, we call it in psychology, their stress levels up a little bit.
Right. So did that athlete who got the crowd all up and clapping, cheering for him, did he win anything in the end?
I believe he did his PB and that was personal best. And I think that was crucial. I think, again, we cannot control winning, but we can control how we perform in terms of our personal best. So he definitely did that because you could see when he finishes, I think it was a jump, a triple jump or something. Because it was many years ago, I can even hardly remember now that you talk about it. And I remember very clearly, he raised his hands, and that to me was obviously it was a happy moment, and obviously he achieved his outcome.
But, at the highest level of sporting achievement, Edgar, whether it's Olympics, whether it's, a major golf champion or a tennis tournament, what value do those live spectators generally bring to having athletes perform at their level best? Because, even with seeing your family up there as well, or knowing that your family is in the crowd as well. So talk about that. What value?
The value would be the social support that they get. In fact, studies show that when athletes utilize the social support they get, both either, in actual physical connection, like, someone talking to you or someone encouraging you, or even just as a spectator, right? The athlete would use that as a psychological edge to say something like in their minds as they prepare for the performance that, so-and-so is here with me and I want to do them proud, or, I'm really, encouraged by all of this, or even the crowds. So it really doesn't matter as long as the athlete finds the crowd or the audience helpful to them, and they can use that. In fact, I've also seen where athletes utilize booing, right? It's a partisan crowd.
Yeah.
The crowd is kind of like cheering for the home team athlete or team itself.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like kind of like booing the opponent. But the opponent utilizes that as a way to psych themselves and say, I'm going to prove you wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I played, my fair share of tournaments, not of course at those kind of levels of like the Olympics and such, or even national level, but, like playing tennis, for instance, and you got family and friends on the sides watching you.
Yes.
It can be for me, okay, maybe I'm not professional enough to be able to handle that extra stress of, oh gosh, I just hit a ball into the net or something, or hit it out. And then, sometimes on the side of your corner of your eye, you see your friend or someone familiar shaking his head, or, and you feel that extra pressure, like, oh, I've just let them down, or I wish I did better at that last shot I hit, kind of thing. So it can sometimes affect the athlete negatively, you think? Can it?
Certainly. That's, again, how they manage their mindset and how they manage their emotions all at the same time. So I guess to me, it's always about doing what you do in practice, and therefore at the highest level, practice, training, or even simulated practice, we call it, where we simulate competitive situations and things like that, are very crucial. If you think about it, athletes also often go international, where they maybe a few months before the actual major tournament that they're aiming for, right? They go out and overseas and things like that. And then they use the opportunity to kind of like simulate competitive situations and of course the crowd situations, so that they can then, have competitive plans in dealing with those situations. So again, it's also about planning ahead. It's also about, dealing with potential distractions. And you're right. Experienced athletes, world-class athletes, they do this, almost like a daily basis kind of thing. So they are used to crowds, no crowds, because they may have gone to international competitions where perhaps, there's nobody there because nobody really cares about that sport, for example. I've been to competitions where no one's around, no crowds, maybe a handful, sparse numbers, but, that's it. But, you go to like the Olympics, right? It's like everyone's there. So again, you can see the stark differences. I guess the more experienced you are, the better. And again, having a plan of action, having a refocusing plan, we call it in sports psychology, where you have an action plan to refocus your mind, your emotions, in order for you to bring out the best in yourself.
Yeah, I remember, before a golf tournament or something, I would go to sleep imagining, not quite that hole in one, but imagining something really good about the next day that might happen on the golf course. And I imagine maybe that's the same with these athletes. But Edgar, have there, been studies that show a correlation between a drop in performance with a drop or absence of spectators at that, apex of sporting performance?
In fact, the very, very first study in sport psychology, I think it was in the 1900 something. It's way back, right? They actually did a study on crowd or audience effect, and they had cyclists, right, cycle, and then they got the crowds to cheer, and then another group with no crowds. They found that, for simple tasks like that, when you have a crowd cheering for you, performance is enhanced. However, if the task is complex, for example, like in gymnastics or something where, it requires complex eye-hand coordination and coordination of the body, right? Any of those noises or even crowd encouragement, if you will, might be a distraction. So again, it depends on the skill level. It depends on the experience. It also depends on the personality of the person, the athlete themselves, because how they manage or how they deal with the environment and the crowds is crucial to their success or losses, if you will.
Wow, there's so many factors at play. Yeah.
Yeah, so many factors. That's the complexity of this whole issue. But I guess my advice to people or athletes who are out there right now is to just treat this like normal training. And, in some trainings, you have nobody. So treat it as doing it at home, literally. So in your comfort zone and things like that. That way, just do as per normal, I think would be my best advice.
So, Edgar, different strategies recommended to and adopted by athletes of different sports. Let's talk about that where the mental game is concerned. I mean, there are some which are long, like marathons, or open water swimming, like Team SG athlete Chantal Liu. Some require that momentary precision, like, our divers, Jonathan Chan and Frida Lim. And I always go back to that sort of, percentage, that quote of the mental game of golf. And, 90% of golf is mental, or 99% of golf is mental, and 1% is actually the game. So talk about the different sort of mental strategies where the game is concerned.
Certainly. We have what we call the closed skill sports where the environment doesn't change, like in diving, in shooting, in gymnastics, where the performance itself is important as it is. And whatever happens in the environment really doesn't matter, because what matters is what they're doing. So that in itself is what we call a closed skill, where the focus is on repetition, execution of the repetitive movements and things like that. Right? The other kind is what we call racing sports. So people like the swimmers, where they need to have a race plan, right? So that they know what to do at different segments of the race, and that's where their focus will be. The third kind would be what we call team sports, where you are a team sport where, like soccer, netball, and things like that, rugby and games like that, hockey and stuff, where athletes need to work with one another and be able to coordinate their efforts towards a common goal. The other one is what we call combat sports, right? Where combat sports are your martial artists, where they have to spar. And this one has got, open-ended, where you cannot predict what will happen based on your opponents that you're going to deal with. They might come up with something, tricky that you didn't anticipate. And then lastly, what we call racket sports, where they have to focus on the implement, where they have to manage the implement, like, for example, the rackets or the bats, where, table tennis bat, for example, to control the ball, or even in golf too, because that's the implement of the golf club. So these are what we call the 5 major types of psychological demands that we see in sport, and athletes who are good at what they do are able to manage these focus points for them to help themselves manage the performance situation. So if you think about it, crowd or no crowd, no difference, because what matters is the routine that they have to follow through. It is the race plan they must follow through. It is the game plan they have to follow through. It is the combat plan they have to follow through. So that probably is, in my mind, the most important thing outside of the social element of the crowds and the audiences.
Now, Edgar, some sports actually do allow sports psychologists and coaches to come alongside the athletes, midway through the competition to, talk to them. What happens during those opportunities when there is such conversation going on? What do the coaches and psychologists typically, tell their athletes?
This is like kind of the secret of the work we do, right?
Okay, we won't broadcast this part.
No. Just smiling also to myself because, we've done all the work, preparing for this major tournament. So honestly, we don't do very much is other than, helping them relax and, just chatting with them and sometimes just cracking jokes because they're nervous. So I just want to make sure they're comfortable where they are. So yes, and I've been at the Olympics where I've stepped into the arena where I actually do speak with athletes, or of course in other major tournaments too. And yeah, the secret really is have fun. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity. So go and have fun, do what you love doing and do it because you enjoy this sport and not because you have to prove anything to anybody.
Yeah.
And that way it helps them calm down. It helps them to just go back to normal. Again, the key here is do what you do in training. You spend 80-90% of time practicing. So why are you changing the way you do things? In fact, I remember a time when there's an athlete who took too much vitamin C for whatever reason. He took half the bottle. Yes.
Wow.
And the person basically had diarrhea the whole night, couldn't sleep, and the next day just basically bombed out.
Yeah. Edgar, just very, very quickly, if you just had one thing to say to all 23 of Team Singapore athletes, what would you say to them?
Go out there, have fun.
Lovely. Oh gosh, that's wonderful. And I'm sure and hopefully they will as well, and do us proud. Edgar, thank you so much for speaking to us this morning.
My pleasure.
We've been speaking with Edgar Tham, and he's founder and chief sport and performance psychologist at Sport Psych Consulting.